It was the night before Christmas, and all through the house not a creature was stirring except for my spouse. Wait a minute, that's the wrong Christmas story. You want me to read the Christmas story. The actual Christmas story is in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, but I'm going to read the short version and leave out some of the details, because this is the version that's usually read during presentations in plays, and it has the most famous language. In the day, Caesar Augustus issued a decree that a census should be taken of the entire Roman world. This was the first census that took place while Quirinius was governor of Syria. And everyone went to his or her own town to register. So Joseph also went up from the town of Nazareth in Galilee to Judea, to Bethlehem, the town of David, because he belonged to the house of David. He went there to register with Mary, who was pledged to be married to him and was expecting a child. While they were there, the time came for the baby to be born, and she gave birth to her firstborn, a son. She wrapped him in cloth and placed him in a manger, because there was no room for them in the inn. O holy night, the stars are brightly shining. Peace on earth and goodwill toward men. In the book of Galatians, chapter 4, verse 4, the great apostle Paul talks about the fact that in the fullness of time, at just the right time, Christ was born. The timing of the birth of Christ is essential to understand. This Advent was expected. There were high hopes and high expectations. And interestingly enough, when it says in the Psalms, peace on earth, goodwill toward men, at the time of the birth of Christ, there was already peace on the earth because of the great Roman Empire, Pax Romana. 27 BC to about 180 AD, 206 years of virtual peace throughout the known world because of Rome's conquering fist. There was nothing but peace on earth. So the Christ child was born in a time of peace already. In a time when the world flourished because of Rome. Road systems were built. People could freely come and go without being assaulted. They could go on the roads, or they could hop on a ship, and you had commerce and trade and philosophical thought and the sharing of ideas. The world was at peace because the iron fist of Rome made it so. And this Christ child was born at this particular time. And so let's just go through the story, and let's set some historical and some cultural and some political stuff so that you'll have a better sense of the world back then. This was the very first census of its kind ever. Why do you think the great Caesar instituted a census? Money? Absolutely. He wanted to be sure that all the taxes were being paid to make sure that the Roman Empire could continue to maintain this world dominance, otherwise known as Pax Romana, and peace on earth, according to the Roman style of worship. So, absolutely, it was insistent that you go back to your home. Now, why do you think that they were all sent back to their homes? You had to go back to your own tribe, to your own area. Why, we pay our taxes wherever we are today. Milwaukee, you're here in Florida, and if it happened that you were here, you'd still pay your taxes. But he wanted everyone to go back. Why? Huh? You like when I roam and get near the fire? Why did he send everybody back to their homeland? Well, quite simply because he didn't want to miss anybody. He didn't want to miss anybody, and you could tax more depending upon the particular section that you happen to live in. And he was very interested in Palestine, which of course is where the Jews primarily were living, and there were lots of Jewish traditions and Judaism proper. So this is the first time that he actually allowed the Judaic system to tax its own people in its own way. Everyone else in the Roman Empire had to be taxed the Roman way. So everyone went to their own town to register. So Joe gets up and he takes off with Mary. Now they were betrothed. In those days, you were betrothed for 1 year. Now in those days, betrothal meant no sex at all. No unchaperoned visits. Betrothal was a 1-year period, and so the fact that he was betrothed to her and she was pregnant looked a little suspicious, I'm sure, to the fellow Nazarenes. So the idea that he got to go to Bethlehem, just a few miles away, is not a bad idea because nobody would know him there. So there'd be less gossip. Don't we all do the same thing? I live in Daytona Beach, so when I want to sin, I come to Orange City. When I don't want to be known, I go someplace else. We do the same thing today, so there is some advantageous aspects to the fact that they were forced to travel back to Bethlehem and forced to go back to the tribe of David, where, of course, Joseph was from. And, of course, you realize that this travel was about 3 days. And so to get there over a 3-day journey, some 70-odd miles, it's about 6 miles, 7 miles from Jerusalem to Bethlehem, but about 70 miles from Nazareth to Bethlehem. So it would take about 3 days, and it's likely that you would arrive at night. Now, if you arrived at night in Bethlehem in those days, there would be no place for you to stay. In those days, there weren't hotels, and you couldn't make reservations online. You would stay with extended family. And there was 2 levels to a house. There was the lower level and the upper level. The upper level is where the humans stayed. The lower level is where the animals stayed. In my house, that's both levels. Because they're all animals. But downstairs is where the animals were kept. All manner of animal. And upstairs is where the people would sleep. So if they arrived late at night, probably, there would be no place left upstairs. So no room in the inn. And the idea that they had to stay with the animals or a stable, really the truth is they probably had to stay downstairs and sleep alongside or around the animals. Now, having your animals downstairs in your house in this particular time had a second purpose. The first purpose was to keep them safe. The second purpose was, can anyone guess? Yes, central heating. Central heating with special smell and fragrance. Because it would be smelly there. It would not be pleasant. But those animals, the heat would rise and heat the house. And so there was a reason to keep your animals in your downstairs. So they had to stay with the animals. There was no room for them in the inn. And of course, she delivered. Can you imagine what this delivery must have been like without a midwife or an obstetrician or anyone? How she delivered. And there was, of course, no fancy cribs. You know, I like the songs, Away in a Manger, No Crib for a Bed, The Little Lord Jesus Laid Down His Sweet Head. Some of the songs, some of the music we have over the years created this vision of loveliness when in fact they used a feeding trough. That's all a manger was a dirty animal feeding trough. That's what a manger was. They had no place to lay him, so they put him in the trough from which one of the animals probably ate. And that was all right. But she wrapped her child first in swaddling clothes. How many of you wrapped your babies in swaddling clothes when they were born? One. And that child has been swaddling ever since. What did they do this for? Today when you have your child given to you, it's wrapped in a blanket, he or she, and a bow put in the hair and handed to you. In the best case of scenarios. Unless you want to see the child right from the canal, and then it's a little messy. Some do that. But swaddling clothes, in this particular part of the world in the 1st and 2nd centuries, they would bind the body like a mummy. You know why they did that? They would use bandages, swaddling bandages, and bind the body, and bind the hands, and bind everything up. Do you know why the ancients did this? To make sure that your limbs were strong and straight, and that you didn't grow crooked. That was their belief. So they would bind the children up for a few days and sometimes for months to ensure strength and safety and a nice basketball or football during the holidays. You're listening. So she was expecting. While they were there, the time came for the baby to be born, and she gave birth to her firstborn, a son. She wrapped him in clothes and placed him in a manger because there was no room for him in the inn. No room for him in the inn. And that's the story. And then the shepherds came. And then the magi came. And they were guided by a star. Now, in those days, stars were like they are today, pretty high up in the sky. So the actual guidance by a star probably simply meant that any one star could be over Jerusalem or Bethlehem. There were many of them. So Magi, were they wise men? No, they were actually pagans. They were people who had different faith systems and beliefs. You have to keep in mind, in the 1st and 2nd century, Rome was in charge. There was Judaism. There was the Roman state cult. You know what that was? You had to obey the emperor. You had to make obeisance in public to the emperor. And of course, followers of Christ wouldn't do it. And the Romans would say, why don't you just go along with it? Even they themselves didn't think it was a big deal, and they weren't really necessarily in belief that Caesar Augustus was a god, but all Roman emperors deified themselves. And so they insisted that all of their Roman citizens and conquerors had to bow in public. And the Christians who follow Christ wouldn't do it. And so we now know that what did they do to them? They fed them to the lions, or they burned them at the stake because they refused to bow. And there are accounts where the officers would say, just pretend. Just pretend. You don't have to even mean it. Just go along with it. You can believe what you want to in private. We don't even believe it. But we don't want to be killed. And they said, no, this baby that was born in a manger is the Christ, the Son of the living God. And they refused to follow the deity of the Roman emperor, and so they were killed. So this great silent night, this great holy night, all is calm, all is bright. Yeah, all was calm because the whole world was full of peace. All was bright because, yeah, everybody expected a Messiah to be born, and they thought this was he. And if we had more time, I'd go into the details of the Sadducees and the Pharisees and the Zealots and the different religious systems already in place that expected the birth of a child, and yet refused to acknowledge that this was the one, because of political unrest and advantageous situations where you could win and gain favor from the Caesar by doing certain things. Having said that, silent night, holy night, all is calm, all is bright. The Christ child was born in a time of peace. He offered hope, he offered joy, and he still does. For millions of people, the mention of Christ in Christmas, or the mention of Silent Night or Holy Night, brings us to joy and excitement. And many of us today have very different ideas about who this child was. Most scholars today, regardless of their belief system, believe in the authenticity of the birth of this child. There are enough records in existence to verify it. There's just some question about whether or not this was the Son of God, the holy child. And that each of us, we all make our own judgments and our own decisions on that particular aspect. But then again, we all do that with everything, don't we? We decide about the identity and the value of one another. And so on this Christmas season, as we begin, there's a brief look at the story of the birth of Christ, the actual manger birth. So now you know, when you see these little nativity scenes, how it really should have looked. They weren't probably in any kind of outdoor stable. You might, when you walk up to a scene or something in public, if you can find one in public, or here in someone's house, go ahead and just take the little figures and break them apart and make it proper according to history, because it didn't look that way at all. Keep in your head, it was a 2-story house. They were inside in an interior area. Probably he was laying in a dirty feeding trough. It was smelly, and it was filthy, and it was hot down there, and there were all kinds of cattle lowing. Yeah, you bet they were lowing. Christmas did not happen on December 21st. You know that, right? That's a Middle Ages monk tradition. Let's just set it for that date. It didn't even happen in winter, because the shepherds kept their flocks on the hills at night. It's too cold in Israel to keep your sheep on the hills at night. It probably happened in spring, March or April, because everybody was in for Passover anyway. A much better time for the census, because you wouldn't lose out on taxes, and Caesar knew it. So Christ, the child, was probably born in the spring, not in the winter. And there were plenty of shepherds and plenty of sheep, because for Passover, you had to have a sheep and a lamb to sacrifice. So it's sad, and I hate it, all the great songs about do not open until December 25th. The truth of the matter is, this particular Christ child was likely born in the spring, not in the winter. And so I expect to come over to your house in March or April, and your Christmas tree will be up, like good Unitarian Universalists, trying to capture the context of the past. Having said that, welcome to the Christmas Advent season of 2013. If you're going to clap, do it. There we go. I mean, if you're not going to, that's okay too.